Good afternoon, everyone. How are you doing? Are you enjoying today? Oh, I'm so glad. It's been great to meet everybody, and it's been wonderful to spend time, and I'm glad that you're enjoying the program. We've got, I think, almost 4,000 people here in Washington, D.C., and also so many are joining us online all over the world, so welcome to you as well. And we have a wonderful, wonderful person here who I have really enjoyed getting to know. Christine Lagarde, the head of the IMF, welcome. And before we start, I really want to thank Sadia and her team for being here. Sadia is with the World Economic Forum and who was instrumental on our panel on artificial intelligence, on workforce development, and on equality. And we're just delighted that the World Economic Forum could be here today to support these discussions and to facilitate a multi-stakeholder dialogue. So we now have the opportunity to talk to Christine Lagarde. There's so many exciting things going on around the world, and I hope that we'll have the opportunity to talk about things that are important to both of us, like equality and equal pay. It's Equal Pay Day, so I know you've spoken so passionately about that and the role of women in leadership around the world, and giving us a global perspective on that would be just wonderful. And if there's other areas that we could touch on as well, like how the world is doing and where we're going, and maybe France. I don't know if we could come back to your country you know quite a bit about. But anyway, Christine, maybe you could tell us your perspective. Here we are in Washington, D.C. on Equal Pay Day. We just saw Lily Ledbetter. Oh, she's right here. America's most passionate evangelist for equal pay, who's transformed our country. Can you give us your perspective on where we are?
Sure. Well, thank you so much, Mark, for having me in conversation with you in front of all your guests here. I would say, first of all, that many more talented women like her are going to be needed on an ongoing basis. Because regrettably, while there has been progress, thanks to women passionate about women's rights, people in general being passionate about equality, there is still a lot of work to be done. And if I look at the global picture, not just what's happening in Washington, not just what's happening in OECD countries, which are generally considered as the advanced economies in the main, the difference between women and men is just mind-boggling. And if you look just at wage and the gender gap in that respect, we're talking about pretty much a 50% difference between what a man receives on average and what a woman receives on average. Now, I know it doesn't mean much of anything because we're talking about global populations, we're talking about average, we're talking about the number and the data that we have. But the likelihood is that it would get actually a lot worse if we had real data. Because in most cases, in many countries around the world, women are in the informal sector and are not actually accounted for whenever they are paid. So when they are paid a lot less than men anyway, on the top of which they generally have to have that other job, which consists of raising the children and trying to make ends meet. So that 50% is not a very happy percentage. It's a lot better in OECD countries. The average in OECD countries is 16%. And it's just a pity that today is the 4th of April and not the 1st of January. And it shows that in this country, as well as in other OECD countries, there's a big difference for equal work between men and women. Now, I've said many times over, because I'm passionate about it as a matter of principles, but I'm also determined about it as a matter of economic sense. And we at the IMF are now doing some solid analytical work about the empowerment of women, what it brings to the table in terms of GDP, and it's significant. It varies from, you take everything, being equal. So men, women, equal pay, no gender gap in terms of labor force participation. The GDP of the United States, the size of the economy would be just 5% bigger. So a bigger pie that you can allocate better. And for those who want to reduce excessive inequality, it's always easier to do it when you have more growth. So 5% here, but you look at Egypt, which is visiting Washington at the moment, we're more talking about an additional 34%. And anything in between, from Saudi Arabia to India to Japan, you have varying, always increases in the size of their economies. Now, it's not just the size of the economy, it's also unbelievably effective in terms of reducing inequalities. Because the first basic inequality is the inequality between men and women. The one that is most efficient in terms of output if you eliminate it. Third, what we've also found in our study is that, and I'm talking here macroeconomic, we can talk about the corporate level and what it means in terms of enterprises. But in terms of macro, it also means more diversification. So you have it's like a triple bonus, if you will. You bring women to the table in terms of labor force participation and gender gap, equal with men. You increase the pie, you facilitate the reduction of inequality, and you diversify the economy. Why does it matter? Because everybody wants growth at the moment. I haven't met any of our 189 country members who doesn't say, I need more growth, we want more growth. Well, India at the moment is probably okay with their growth levels, but the rest of the world, they all want growth. And for many of those countries, whether in the advanced economies world or in the emerging market economies, you have another issue, which is aging population. And in many instances, such as in Japan, such as in Germany, and soon to be in China, you have a shrinking working age population. Now, clearly, in those countries that are migrant adverse, as is the case for Japan, for instance, the easiest response is bring the women. And they are much more competent anyway.
Okay, well, I'm sorry we don't have a woman to lead the panel, but...
No, can I tell you something which I think is really interesting? For those of you who have had their doubts about quotas, I was one of those when I initially started, genuinely assuming that because of my talent and my merits, I should be given space. Woo. So what made me really change my mind is when I became partner at Baker McKenzie, which is, and still today is the largest international law firm headquartered in Chicago. And I realized when I was moving up the chain of partners to become the chairman of the firm, that there was only 9% partners who were female. And that if we did not have quotas, it would take us 3 generations before there was a decent representation of women. So I changed my mind and agreed, together with many others, that quotas for a period of time was a necessity. And very much the conventional wisdom is, well, if women are promoted because of quotas, it's, number one, unfair. Number two, it facilitates access for the mediocres. Well, there's been a recent study that was conducted that really is focused on Sweden, because Sweden is one of those countries that has had quotas in politics for many, many years now. And they've studied the impact of bringing women through quotas and through the zipping system, where you have, for list of candidates, 1 woman, 1 man, 1 woman, 1 man, 1 woman, 1 man. Because otherwise, if you put all the men at the top and the women at the bottom, only men get selected. So they were really sophisticated about it. And what resulted from that was a significant improvement of the quality of the men. Because they realized, and really demonstrated that empirically, that all these sort of mediocre leaders who were there, who had their sort of vested interests in place, were surrounding themselves with other mediocre men so that they could sort of carry on and keep their seat. Whereas by bringing in those women who were selected on the basis of their talent, gradually the most mediocres actually had to go. and felt uncomfortable or simply were not re-elected. So that developed a real meritocracy amongst the men as well. So men who survive in environments that are pretty equal are really top-notch men. That's for you.
Okay, thank you, Christine, again. So is what you're saying is women are the key to growth? Is that what we need to do to reignite growth in the planet?
Well, it's not the only thing we need to do. We need to do many more things. But if we could sort of magically reduce to zero the gender gap and have the same labor force participation between men and women, yes, it would generate growth across the economies, both in advanced, emerging, and low-income countries. Absolutely. I mean, there are many more things that can be done, that have been done. You know, I can go through monetary policy, fiscal policy, structural reforms, and the combination of the three and the sequences and so on and so forth. But I'm often surprised that policymakers and decision makers in the corporate world do not understand that it's an immediate response to some of their problems.
So this is really one of the key secondary messages in an equal pay day, that not only do you see this kind of wage gap, it's really because women are being repressed in society and economically, and if you're able to somehow remove that veil and let those women rise up, you'll get a huge surge of growth.
Correct.
So let me ask.
It will take policies. It will take money. It will take cultural changes. So that's the reason I'm talking about this magical instant where the gap is closed and the labor force participation is equal, because it doesn't happen just like that. And it's also a question of sheer determination and never giving up. It's a matter of, I'll give you an example, and things are different depending on the countries. We've done a study on 150 countries, borrowing data from the World Bank, which is our sister entity from the Bretton Woods institutions. And of those 150 countries, 95% have in their constitution or in their legal system discriminations against women. 95% out of 150 countries. And, some people might say, oh, but that's just, the legal system. No. It really matters, because we have seen instances where when the legal barriers are eliminated, it actually makes a difference in labor force participation and in that gender gap we were talking about. We saw the example of Peru, for instance. Peru had, a general equal principle. But they had this interesting sort of sub-legislation level, sort of rules based on uses and customs that were still applicable in many corners of Peru. And those prevailed over other principles. So when they realized that, they decided to change the constitution and to embed in the constitution the principle that anything in that respect would override the uses and customs that continued to apply in some corners of Peru. Well, within 5 years, there was 15% increase of labor force participation, and the gender gap was reduced as well. We had the same phenomenon in Namibia. I think we had the same phenomenon in Malawi. And everywhere, legislators have to look into their system to see where there is discrimination and where it can be just removed.
Yeah, that we can really upscale this conversation to discrimination, right? It's also, we at Salesforce, just looking at us and our own little tiny slice of the pie here, which is, we try to fight for equality wherever we go, and it's in our interest to do that. We're the largest tech employer in Indiana, and when we saw the governor, now the vice president, sign that law into place, we had to enter into a discussion and negotiation with him to remove those discriminations against the LGBTQ community in Indiana. That's in our interest because we want to be able to have all those great workers in our company. We don't want there to be discrimination or for them to push those great people out of the state. And in the same way, we want to have all the great women and all the great members of every community, every sexual orientation, every race, everybody part of, Salesforce, part of our economy. That will help us, rise up. So it's quite selfish. So to that point, of course, we could go through a lot of these countries that you mentioned, and there is, this kind of gestalt of discrimination. It's out there, and it does cast a shadow on different economies. Do you think this is a call to arms for these countries for growth if they want to do something quite actionable, is to look at their discrimination policies?
I think that's, it's in a way, it's step number one. But then you have further steps to explore. I would say that the next one, particularly for the emerging market economies and low-income countries, it's education. How is my education system working? And is it working for both genders equally? How can we improve that situation? And the policymakers in various corners have engineered some mechanisms to actually encourage families to send their girls to school, because very often what you saw was the boy would go to school, the girl would stay home. And if you think about the Bolsa Familia in Brazil, for instance, it's only paid to the mother. Now, we can go into the reasons for that, but maybe not. But it's only paid provided that the children go to school, and more importantly, that the girls go to school. Mexico is putting in place a similar system as well, which is conditional upon the daughters going to school. So education is another, critical step for those countries. If you look at advanced economies, there are also discriminations that are much more subtle. Think about the tax system. In many countries, including my own actually, the tax base for income tax purposes is the family. Well, guess what? The tax burden is much higher on the second earner, mathematically. Who is generally the second earner? The wife. So clearly one response to that is to change the tax base and to move from family base to individual base, because you then ipso facto eliminate that discrimination. I'll give you the example of Japan, because we've done a lot of work with Prime Minister Abe and his wife, for that matter, who really endorsed the principle of empowering women, opening the labor force for women, and so on and so forth. So once you've taken those steps of removing the discrimination, having a tax system that is respectful of individuals while being favorable to families, but eliminating discrimination, then you need to think about what is preventing women from eventually joining the workforce. Well, luckily, Prime Minister Abe and his wife were convinced that by increasing significantly the budget that would be spent on childcare centers, increasing significantly the sort of benefits paid to a parent, when that parent, I didn't say mother, I said parent, that decides to stay home to look after the new child. That also made a difference. But it's not it, because while 1 million additional Japanese women joined the workforce as a result, there is still, sort of entrenched in the cultural background of people this bias against women's participation. And it touches on all sorts of very trivial, I don't know if anybody is here from Japan, but please challenge me if I get that wrong. But the way in which the work, daily life is organized does not facilitate the participation of women. The way in which people are expected to stay late, to go out after work, and to eventually then come home, maybe. This is not conducive. I hate doing what I'm doing because it's almost a caricature of what it is, but some of these attributes are still actually alive in many cultures. It doesn't help. And those cultural changes will happen if there is strong endorsement by the leadership, both at the country level, but also at the company levels. And what you're doing at Salesforce is really, you know, I wouldn't say gold standard because you never want to use that again, but but it's a really great standard that you're setting.
So is what you're saying that when we look at growth, which is something that, you know, when every country, every CEO wants, they want to have a growth. It's one of our values at Salesforce. Growth is important to us. We're one of the fastest growing software companies. And when we meet as a management team, we look for growth. And, you know, you're making a subtle point where I'm going to have to actually go and look, even in our culture, there must be things that we're doing that could be preventing us from going even faster. So when we're looking at things like a culture, like you mentioned, you know, Japan, but there's so many other cultures that we could look at, that not only is it kind of a veil of discrimination that needs to be lifted, but then all of a sudden you could hit a cultural limit where, yes, you can remove the policies and the laws of discrimination, but you may then hit the cultural limits.
I'll give you a couple of anecdotes because you are so right. When I was chairman of Baker McKenzie, I had this army of lawyers around the world. And I was headquartered in Chicago, but I was also traveling into other countries where we had offices. And I would typically tour associates' offices, because they're the ones who are trying to prove themselves and to show that they are partnership material and that they can go a long way and so on and so forth. And I would tour offices at sort of 7 p.m. in the early evening, just to walk around, just to check on what people were up to, what kind of work they were doing. And invariably, I was finding men, not women, men. And many of them were either reading the newspaper or consulting some case law, doing things that did not require them to be physically in the office, that they could certainly have done from home, had they wanted to be at home. The women were probably doing the same thing, but they were doing it at home. By just touring around and pointing to them that reading the newspaper at the office was maybe not the best use of their time, and that if they were trying to show off by having lots of billable hours, which couldn't be billed to anybody for that matter because they were just reading the newspaper, that was not the right thing to do. Two more things that we have done at the IMF. We are encouraging sort of remote location work from home. And one day, one of my advisors came to me and said, if you don't do it yourself, and let it be known that on, you know, Thursday, the 12th of April, you're going to be working from home, people will feel a bit intimidated if they do it. So we decided to do that. But that was not enough. I asked my first deputy managing director, who is a man, to do the same thing and to let it be known so that it was then okay and perfectly acceptable to actually work from home, and work could be discharged just in the same way as it is discharged from home, from the office. So I think those, you know, little things can actually crack a few cultural resistances that are still out there.
And as we're doing those things, we need to scale them all the way up to the country level, and then scale them all the way down to ourselves individually. And then through that, we can kind of release that. Well, you know, I don't think I could let you...
And we also have to measure. You know, measuring and doing it in a very granular way to make sure that you actually deliver what you commit, I think is really important. Mm-hmm. You know, when you say we want to reach this target, well, measure it along the way, and that's what we're trying to do. It's not always pleasant, because sometimes we have to, because we have to be accountable, and sometimes we have to say, well, we set that target at, you know, 35% of X category, and we're only at 31%. Why is that? But measuring, I think, is really important. You would know that, of course.
When we look at what's happening in Europe, okay, we have female leadership in the United Kingdom and in Germany, And France is going to decide between a female leader and a male leader, which would be pretty amazing, just putting the politics aside for a second, if France, Germany, and the UK all had female leaders. But, you know, give us your perspective of what's happening today in Europe, and how should we be looking at the current political environment?
You know, I will not make any comment on my own country because I can't. By contract with the IMF, I have to refrain from comments. What we're seeing in Europe, and we will probably see more of it in the coming weeks in the various presidential or federal elections and so on and so forth, is a great uncertainty and a degree of disarray from the people, who certainly, for some of them, are facing significant inequality. Although when you look at the reality of inequalities, it has increased in a country like Germany. It has been stable and slightly decreasing in the UK. It has decreased in France, to give you those three countries as examples. But there is that sentiment by people that their expectations are not necessarily going to be met by reality. And it may be what has happened in this country as well, where when you look at numbers, you know, while 40 years ago, 92% of children would make more money and have a better position than their parents. This is no longer true. From that 92%, we are at roughly 50%. And people have the sentiment that this is likely to be even less than that. So that gap between expectations and reality is what needs to be, in my view, addressed while preserving the benefit of globalization, trade, improvement of the standard of living in many corners of the world, bringing people out of poverty, as happened as a result of globalization and trade. But this balance between the positive that we do not want to throw away and waste, and addressing the negatives is, I think, the imperative of the day.
Yeah. Well, I completely agree with that, and you know, I feel like there is this very important relationship between equality, between next generation technologies like artificial intelligence and others, and workforce development, and that these three things are three of the most important things for us to look at, especially as we look at for the you know, the concept of growth and improving the economic situation of everyone. And that's one of the reasons why we, yes.
Yeah. We circle back to the previous panel,
yes,
where it's
right.
so important to actually make sure that education, training, lifelong training is actually going to address some of those negatives and some of those issues of those that feel excluded from the system.
Yeah, and I think that in these things, like, for example, education is equality. I think if you can't have education, and that's why it's so important for all of us to focus on our public school systems and our K through 12 systems here in the United States, for every CEO, for every company to adopt a public school, to make sure that public school has everything it needs to be successful. You know, that if you don't have education, you will not be able to move this. You will not be able to move this forward, and you will not be able to achieve this higher idea of equality. And when we couple it with workforce development, new technologies, the opportunities for growth are in front of us. And I think that you outlined that quite beautifully. So thank you so much for being with us today and giving us that incredible enlightenment. Please thank Christine Lagarde.